Welcome everyone to the Adversity to Advantage podcast. We are recording, which is excellent. And today I've got Laura Hearn on the other end. We had a little snippet of her story on the This Can Happen conference recording that was a few weeks ago. But now we get to go deep. We get to hear the full story. So Laura, welcome to the show.
Hi, Petra. Thanks for having me.
I'm so happy that we've got you on again because I love your story and who you are at the moment and the things that you're doing, which is giving back, talking a lot about mental health. Give our listeners a little bit of an overview about who you are and what you're up to at the moment.
Okay, I'll try and do the short version. So, my day job, I'm a producer at the BBC in television news. I've been there for quite a while now, went straight from university, but alongside that, I've kind of had a parallel life or journey and recovering from anorexia. I was diagnosed in my late teens and really just couldn't get the help that I needed on the NHS or even privately, really. I was not classed as sick enough to be taken as an inpatient on the NHS, and thank God I wasn't, because I think I probably would have come out worse. But so really, alongside my career at the BBC, I led this life where I was in existing, functioning, not very functioning, not existing really very well, anorexic. I relapsed several times, took time off, and was just crippled loneliness in London when you're trying to make friends, and most things evolve around food and socializing, and I would avoid all of those things. And I was just a really sad human, a really angry human. Didn't know how to navigate relationships. I was resentful. I just wanted to punish myself. And eventually, when I was in my 20s, I had a really bad relapse. And the therapist at the time I was seeing, he had met this woman in America who said to my mom, look, if there's any way you can get your daughter to go to the place that she founded, I think it would be really, one of the best shot you could give Laura. And through some generous donations, and eventually my mom selling her house to pay for my 8-month stay there, it was by far the best, most nurturing place I'd ever been, and helped me, gave me the tools to save my life, I suppose.
And I guess I'm interested in this sort of double life thing that you talk about, right? Because I definitely relate to that, and I think many people do, and it might be something very different than anorexia or an eating disorder, but people do, right? We live the mask of what we need to do at work and how we need to show up for our families, and underneath all sorts of things could be going on. So just take us back for a minute before we sort of go a little bit further in depth into your recovery journey. You said you got diagnosed around in your teens, but like in hindsight, were there signs of something going on well before that? What do you recognize just from your childhood or maybe the lead up to the diagnosis?
Yeah, I mean, I was quite late being diagnosed. I was at 18, and that is quite late because I was like an adult, 17, 18. But before that, I did have a kind of strange relationship with food. I felt like I was too big, like I was always taking up too much room, bigger than my peers. I was slightly heavier maybe, but I remember being kind of strange around food. I'd come home and pick at chocolate or cake, but I wouldn't eat the whole thing because I've like convinced myself I hadn't had the whole like piece of cake. Or I'd eat big bowls of cereal until my stomach hurt, and then sit on the toilet and just pinch the tires, not being too graphic, but pinch the tires around my waist and like feeling such disgust of myself. And then I wouldn't really eat normal food, but I guess everyone just thought I was kind of a bit greedy and puppy fat. But in hindsight, it was a comfort eating thing. I was very sad around my parents' divorce and trying to acclimatize living with a new stepfather and things. And I was bullied at school.
How old were you when your parents divorced?
7, 8.
Okay, so I guess I'm trying to help our listeners think, is there a cause for this, or are some of us just born with kind of a mental health issue or something showing up in this way?
Yeah.
But it's a way of coping, right?
No, I don't think I was. Well, I've learned now that there's, I developed an eating disorder because I had three elements to it. I had the genetic predisposition. I'm quite shy. I'm sensitive. I'm perfectionist. I'm, yeah, overly sensitive is what people call me, but I don't mind being, being like that now. And I guess, I like things in order. I like to be liked, all those characteristics. And then when I was 18, pretty much just shortly after I've been diagnosed, about 6 months before, or a year before, my stepfather was killed suddenly in a car crash. And that was probably the catalyst for it. After he died, I went off to Australia and traveled for a year. Pretty much a few weeks after he died, I hadn't acknowledged his death. My mum said, even at the funeral, your feet were up on the pews and you showed no emotion. And really my eating sort of started while I was traveling. I remember we were like sort of traveling on a shoestring really, and went to an all-you-can-eat Chinese buffet, and never had I had this inclination to do anything before, but I hadn't even eaten too much, but I was convinced that I had, and I had to get rid of it. And from that moment on, I just thought, oh my gosh, and it became something in my head. And for the next 6 months, I sort of would eat very little, but get rid of it if I could. And then I just realized it was too obvious. So reduced instead and just restricted. And that was the way my eating disorder developed from there on in. So it was a combination of that. But then I guess the third thing is the cultural climate we lived in. Like, I guess when I developed my eating disorder, there was no social media. So I can't say I was influenced by Instagram or what I see in magazines too much. It was really, in fact, my family didn't even know what eating disorder was when I came back from Australia. And, I looked quite good for a few weeks. Blonde, tanned, and just got off the beach and lost a bit of weight, and everyone's like, oh wow, you look great. And then slowly they realized that actually I couldn't just stop losing the weight. It just kept coming off and off and off. So I guess it was genetic, my makeup, my characteristics, a trauma that I just did not know how to process, the cultural climate. I guess I always felt that to be accepted by my father, my real father, and to get attention, I needed to be thin, successful. So it was a combination of things. It's not one thing. Yeah. I guess if that gives any information.
Yeah, for sure. Because it's just interesting, the trajectory, and often there is trauma, right? So I've got alcohol addiction issues, and it's kind of pinpointing that there's a genetic predisposition, 100%. There's a cultural thing. You can't go anywhere without booze in this country, right? It's kind of people work around that. And there's some trauma in my life. So it's interesting, the similarities of whatever kind of disorder it is. Sometimes it's us just trying to cope with a difficult thing that we're unable to cope with in a different way. And that can help us kind of have compassion for people who are suffering, essentially. So just talk us through your dark times, I guess. Like, how bad did it get for you in order for you then to be desperate enough, and your parents to be desperate enough to sort of ship you off to a whole other continent to get the support you needed?
Mm-hmm. I guess, yeah, it got quite bad. I wanted to take my own life a few times. I crashed my car. I fainted on the tube. But aside from the physical aspects, I just couldn't bear to live the way I was living anymore. I mean, I was just like a walking zombie. I guess there was a lot of self-punishment around Michael, my stepfather's death. Or it didn't matter how many people told me that I didn't need to feel this way, but he really was sort of brought me up, really was my father. And when he died, it was very sudden, and there were many things that I wished I could have said to him, and I had planned to say to him, and I never got that opportunity. And I think not having closure really affected me, and I felt like the only way I could make it up to him for not telling him I loved him enough, etc., was to repent in a way and punish myself. And show him that if I was, if I hurt myself enough, that I was really sorry. And it was a record that my eating sort of just played around again. And now in hindsight, I could think I was a 16-year-old. I didn't do anything wrong. Like, sure. I loved him and we got on, but you don't always get to wrap things up in a nice little bow, and that is really difficult for me. Closure and goodbyes about not having having it neat and tidy. So I didn't know how to process that, and I guess I used it as a way to punish myself. And then alongside that, I desperately craved attention from my real father, and was battling against sort of a dynamic or a relationship with him and his new wife, and I felt that the only way for him to love me or to show me love was to get sick, and that would be but it was just worry. It was negative attention, and we have a great relationship now as a healthy person. But to me, being a child, and which an eating disorder keeps you very much stuck in, I equated worry or concern with love. And so it was, there were some really dark times, and I guess it got to, when I was 27, and I just, I was taking sleeping tablets at nights because I just couldn't get to sleep. I was so hungry. I was not functioning at work. I had to quit work. I was just like I don't know, how do I describe it? I felt like there was a terrorist in my head. I completely felt like I was hostage, and I did not know how to get out. And I often described it as a terrorist, just with, just chaining me somewhere. And I guess having it for so long, it was ingrained in me as well. It had become habitual. So I describe it as sort of speaking Arabic and not knowing how to speak English anymore. My brain just did not compute
There's also
food or emotion or.
There's also a lot of shame, isn't there? There's a lot of shame because you're hiding things, and maybe people are trying to help. And again, you've started university and working, and trying to be normal in quotation points, right? What's the hiding aspect of it like? It sounds like there's a lot of shame there as well.
Yeah, I was an incredibly secretive person. I became a great liar. Now I can't lie about anything. It's just, I have such a conscience. But in your eating disorder, you'll do anything. I guess it's, the same as an alcoholic or drug user. You'll do anything to protect your thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think it is an addiction. I think there's that's one of the story. I don't think an eating disorder is an addiction, but it's definitely you can relate to it in a way. But it was just, I was just such a manipulator, and people walked on eggshells around me, and the people it affected, my mom still is affected by it, not just financially, but mentally, as a grown woman now, she worries about me way more than I suppose the average person, because for so many years she didn't know if I was going to wake up or not. So it has a domino effect around of the people around you. But now I'm through the other side. I actually could say I'm quite grateful for my eating disorder, because I just never thought I would be able to say that. And the relationships and the people that I have in my life now, and the way I am as a human in the world is quite incredible. It took.
I want to circle back to your gratitude around it, because that's pretty fascinating. But talk us quickly through the recovery period. So you do go to it sounds like you've tried to get help several hundred times maybe, through the NHS, and you said you just weren't sick enough, which can be really distressing, to be like, you're not bad enough. Inside, you're describing it as a terrorist in your head, right? And it's just not ticking particular boxes. So you're not even enough of a sick person to get the help that you need.
Yeah, for sure.
How terribly frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, I remember driving to High Barnet. I've been referred to the St Anne's, the eating disorders clinic there, and I drove up there feeling quite, reluctant to go or anxious, and walked in there, and all I saw was girls with drips in their noses, and tubes up their noses, and then I had to wait in reception, and called in, and I saw someone for, I don't know, 20 minutes, and she had like a Filofax folder, and she just asked me a tick box exercise basically about everything I'd already spoken about with the GP. And then at the end kind of shook her head and said, well, I think I could probably offer you like half an hour every 6 weeks with a consultant, and I'll try and get you to see the dietitian if that's possible. And I just went and sat in my car in the car park and burst into tears, and just thought, geez, man, like, you don't think I'm ill enough? Like, what have I got to do? And yeah, I drove off there, and I embarked for the next 4 or 5 months on getting even sicker. So yeah, it was a message that was pretty hard to swallow. And I had an exercise addiction as well. But this is something I always talk about. I remember I lived in Archway in London, and I remember setting my alarm for like 5 a.m. so I could go walk up to the swimming pool and do, my ridiculous amount of lengths that I had to do before I went to work. And I remember waking up and it was snowing that day, and I was so tired, and I just thought, I don't know how I'm going to do this. And I was like, no, you're going to do this. And the eating disorder is so powerful that I put on my wellies and trudged up to the swimming pool, and I was the first one outside, obviously, because no other nutter would be like going to swim at that time. And I was in the pool on my own, and I forced myself to do, all the laps that I had told myself I would do, and then went back home, got ready, went to work, and was exhausted. I just thought, this is such a lonely, sad life. What am I doing? And I guess those kind of times when I reflect back now, I think, oh my God, I would never do that to myself anymore. But I just, I went and saw the dietitian, and he was useless. He didn't tell me anything that I didn't know and didn't really understand. And I had an appointment with him, every once a month. So I didn't really get anything on the NHS. Privately, when I could afford it and my family could afford it, I went to a couple of day patient clinics, which were great. Some were good, some weren't. Some were 12-step, which I don't really think works for me personally, or for eating disorders. It's quite different from alcoholism, but I got some support in those kind of groups. But it was always the same, Petra. Like, I would go to these groups, I would talk about all the traumatic things and all the things that I was not able to process, and then I'd go home and have to eat this food, and I just couldn't do it, because all the stuff that had come up was then I was faced with food, and I just couldn't do it on my own. Some people can, and my experience is only my experience, but going somewhere, I guess it got to the point, and I just gave up, and I just thought, please help me. Like, if there's any way, I guess I felt like I'd got to rock bottom a few times, but this time, all my friends were moving on, having babies, getting married, and there I was still living my lonely life, and I thought I'd rather die than carry on into my 30s like this. So I was willing to do anything, and thank God I was able to go to America.
What was different about that recovery program? Because you tried different things, and obviously it was immersive. You were there for 8 months. You were inpatient, so it was all about you and your recovery. What were the key factors, do you think, that supported you?
Yeah, there were definitely some fundamentals that were different there. One, the woman who founded it, she had recovered from anorexia herself about 20 years previously. She's quite world-renowned now in the world of eating disorders. And originally, in the 70s, 80s, she created a place that she had wished had existed when she was trying to recover. So she literally just bought a house in a cul-de-sac, and it's a 6-bed house, and she just made it a home. It is a home. It's not clinical. It's not a hospital. It's just like walking into someone's house with a kitchen, and and there's only room for 6 people, and a garden. And she then filled it, which was another thing that was quite controversial at the time. But she filled it with a ratio of, I don't know, maybe 40-60 of therapists who had recovered themselves from an eating disorder. So my therapist had recovered herself from an eating disorder, so had the clinical director. Not everyone had, but it made a huge difference. And fundamentally, when I had the first call with Carolyn, when I had the first call with Carolyn when I was in America, when I was in the UK, I spoke to her about whether to come to the treatment centre. And the first, I read 3 pages of her book and burst into tears. And then when I had the phone call with her, I thought, the same thing, this woman gets it like no one else had. She spoke my language. She'd been there. She could tell me that, I've seen thousands of clients like you, Laura. They can get well. You can get well. I'd never had that message. I had every professional known to man, but I never had anyone who could act as a guide, a role model, or say, look, this is going to be really tough, but it's totally better on the other side. And so when I went there, and that was the thing that made me want to go there, to be honest. And when I went there and I saw, people who had recovered living their life, and they understood me, they spoke my language, they knew all the tricks of the trade, I couldn't manipulate them. They were supportive, nurturing. They showed me they gave me a meaning and a purpose outside of my eating disorder. I processed all the grief, the trauma, but I had to eat the food. I had to eat that goddamn food and be contained. And so it wasn't like I could go home and skip something after a day's hard therapy processing. I still had to go to the table and eat my snacks and dinner. Fundamentally, that was.
Was there ever conflict when it came to the actual eating of the food, despite the good or the environment?
Yeah, there was conflicts. In fact, several conflicts. And one of the therapists said my eating disorder was a mother F-U-C-K-E-R, because it was that entrenched. Yeah. They took me into the garden one time and just called me out and was like, Laura, you're not scared of that. There's a lot, don't know if I can swear, but there's a lot of expletives that could be was told to me, because my eating disorder was so strong. But they kind of they understood it and they knew how to get around it. And at first, I think this was quite difficult. At first, they were quite tactile around meal times. So we'd have two therapists at each side, at the end of the tables, and then we would sit in the middle between them. And often the therapist would sort of reach out to me, put a hand on me if I was struggling or crying. I spent 3 weeks crying into every plate of my food. And then it got to a point where they clocked on that the more they did that, the more it was feeding my eating disorder. My eating disorder thrived on attention. And I felt, and it worked by thinking that if I made, it looked like I was really distressed or upset, which I was quite a lot of the time. But if they reacted to that and fed it, then I would always know that the only way I was going to get attention was to look like I, to struggle in my eating disorder. And so they took me aside one time and said, Laura, this isn't that we don't care, but we are not going to pay attention to you at the table. You need to engage with the other girls. Yeah,
telling you is the crucial difference, though, because then you can still feel held and like they're not just ignoring you, right?
Yeah, for sure. No, yeah. You need to engage with the girls at the table, play the games. We understand that your eating disorder needs us to give it attention, and for you to get better, you have to know that you can get your needs met and still be loved and cared for without it. And it was like, it's like a knife going into me at first when I was really struggling, and I felt like everyone was ignoring me. But slowly I got out of it and I started to engage, and I realized I got more attention and more kindness and engagement by actually being a human being and engaging with the other girls. They didn't like seeing me suffer, and everyone was suffering, but for me to have special attention was really not helping me at all. And I think they're the kind of, there was so many nuances, Petra, so many things that they knew, but that's just one example of how the treatment, that they knew it because some of them have been through it. And eventually, I saw Lindsay, my therapist, and she'd go home and walk the dogs after being at the therapy center and, the clinic, and she'd go home to her boyfriend and come in and say what a great night she had the night before. And I was like, oh my God, I want that. Having a life eventually became more important to me than staying stuck in my eating disorder. And sure, I had to process the grief and get rid of that repetitive record that's going through my head that I need to punish myself or repent. But I was always did it in like a caring, nurturing way. But they were pretty harsh at times as well. But that's, you have to be, you can't pussyfoot around an eating disorder. It will. Yeah, you have to really take it by the horns and get angry with it, because it's a prime manipulator, and if you pussyfoot around it, and I think some of the treatment centers, do that here, you're never going to get rid of it.
Yeah, so you have to recognize that it's fucking with your life, and you've got to make a stand and do something different, which is incredibly hard. So you spend 8 months there. What was are you cured? What was the transition like? I know there's you've got to maintain, and it's always, something that might be in the back of your mind. Do you feel like you're fully cured, or what was your maintenance strategy just to transition from that caring home into the fucking real world?
Yeah, it was difficult. But what they also provide there was a transition house. So instead of going from like a womb where you are completely in a protective bubble because it's not the real world, I then spent about 6 weeks in the transition house, which was maybe a mile or so from the other house, and I would go back for my sessions every day. And it worked on a level system in the actual treatment center, so level 1 to 4, and level 1 is where you're completely immersed in there. You don't, you can't go into the kitchen or prepare food, and then slowly as you have you're accepted onto the next level, you have to demonstrate certain goals really that you've achieved. And it's not all around just your weight, it's around whether you've achieved goals with your group, etc. Like, so for example, I always used to get dressed in my tracksuit bottoms and didn't make any effort, because for me it was easier to be like that. And I was like, well, I'm not going anywhere, why do I need to make an effort? And then one of the goals I had that week was, you have to get up every day before breakfast and present yourself at the table and get dressed properly. And I hated it. I was like, what's the point? But so it was about sort of building up my self-esteem. They wanted me to go out and get some new clothes and things like that. And so eventually when you get to level 4, you can go out on a pass, and you can go to the cinema or whatever and have a bit more independence. So you don't go from nothing to then the transition house. So once I was on level 4, I spent a bit of time there, and I was quite independent, making my own food and stuff in the house. And then I spent about 6 weeks in the transition house, where I just go back and wean myself off. And really, some people spent a year in the transition house, but that was the luxury, they had to afford it and to live in America. So then coming back to the UK was pretty tough. I didn't really want to. I was desperately sad. I'd made a community there. I'd been there for 8 months.
You've got your old
sorry?
You've got your old triggers as well when you come back to your own kind of neck of the woods.
Yeah, I remember walking into my flat, a shared flat, and I was like, oh my God, I feel so lonely. No one knows what, you've been somewhere for 8 months in an experience, and it was difficult. And then going back into like the world's busiest newsroom, walking down those stairs into like the pit of like everyone running around in the news. It was, it hasn't been easy, but slowly I have rebuilt my life and gone back to work, and the foundations of what they laid there, I've pretty much kept myself well. It's not, and I think it's because over there they fed my soul and they fed my mind. They didn't just feed my body. And over here, from my experience, there are some great places here, I think, exist, but from my experience, all they focused on within me was, feed your body, put the weight on, what number are you on the scales? And the amount of relapse rates over here are huge, because if you don't sort the head out and the soul and everything that's going on between, you can put the weight on, but eventually you're going to go back to the way you were before. It's like, a prisoner walks out of prison with a clean film bag of all his belongings, and he goes back into an environment, and unless he's been given the tools and the education or removed from that environment, he's going to end up back in. So I don't think it's financially that economical the way the treatment model over here works. But I have, in the last, when did I came out in 2012, so I guess it's been a little while now, and I have grown, and every day I'm still learning about myself and how to keep myself well. And it hasn't been, I can't say it's been 100% stable the whole time. I've had some dips, but the dips have never been the way they were before. And I know I will never have that opportunity to go back into that place again. Some people do have returned because they've relapsed, but financially it will never ever be an option for me. And also, I don't even want to go back there, even if it was an option. I did go back about 3 years ago. We had a retreat, and I went back and I spoke to a couple of the clients in there as someone who had been in there before. And I walked in there, and it was so warm, and everyone was so lovely. But did I want to be there again? No. I didn't want to be sitting around there crying in front of my jacket potato, whatever it was.
No, of course not. So what are one or two of the things that you try and consistently do to keep yourself well? So if somebody's struggling, what are some of the practical ways that you maintain your mental health or recovery from the eating disorder?
Yeah, okay, so honesty. And I have been guilty of this myself, about being in denial at times. I mean, everyone's eating disorder is different and everyone's recovery is different, but for me, I've noticed that if I get really busy and overwhelmed, I get into a negative place, which spirals into thinking, I can't do all this. I get anxious. Anxiety feeds my eating disorder. And so I've had to let go, especially in the last 6 months. I've realized I can't do everything, and to prioritize and not to get into a negative space. And that has required honesty by having some home truths told to me, like, this is your pattern. You get like this and it affects your recovery. So I an eating sort of thrives in secrecy, and so everything I do now has to be about honesty and just being authentic. So whatever I write or say, I just don't hide behind a facade anymore, and I talk. And I've realized that when you take my eye off the ball, so I stopped having a therapist for a good year, because I thought, I'm doing really well now, why do I need a therapist? And then slowly realizing that actually I do need a therapist still, and recently got one, but to keep me on track, just to keep me accountable, to stop my negative thinking going back in. So I have found that's something that I need to do. Connections, they always said that relationships will keep you well. So I can tend to isolate. I quite like my own time, my own space, and I'm quite shy and I don't like being in big groups. But I have always, even I remember I shared this with you when we went to this event. I was like, my natural instinct is to avoid big things, but every time I go and I see someone,
must come.
yeah, it's making the effort to get yourself out of there, which is kind of like a bit of a parallel, because I'm quite an adventurous. So I'll do skydiving or bungee jumping. If you told me to do that tomorrow, I've done them, I'd do them again. But some things about being in large groups of people, I find difficult. So
it's being seen, isn't it?
Yeah, being seen and heard and valued. And for me, I really need space in the countryside to clear my head. I'm very much an animal person, and being with the horses really helped me. So yeah, I'm honesty, sleep. I find sleep, if I'm tired, I get emotional and I don't function very well. Not overwhelming myself, making sure I get enough time out in space in the countryside for me, and relationships, and yeah.
Cool. Those are the really good practical tips that I think can apply to so many people going through so many different things. So 2 final questions for you, Laura. First one, where can people find you if they want to connect? 'Cause I know you do speaking on these topics, and I know you work for the BBC, but you also have your own sort of side hustle, should we call it. Where can people find you, first of all?
Yes, so my platform is Jigsy's Place. So that's JIGGSY, Jigsy's Place, which is originally was just an art blog that I created for people to share stories, experiences, hope, and messages of their eating disorder and mental health. And it might sound a bit cliched, but I call it Jigsy's Place because it's one big jigsaw where I guess I never felt like I fitted in. And when I came back from America, I really wanted to create a place where everyone could, share their piece in the puzzle, I guess, and create one big global jigsaw where everyone felt like they read someone else's story or saw their picture or image or creation and would relate. So you can find me on Jigsy's Place, and then my website is also the same, where I do recovery coaching, and also I do lots of speaking around mental health in the workplace and how to transition back into the workplace, and to navigate areas within sort of confidence and identity and rebuilding yourself after a mental health issue. So yeah,
and you're sort of paying it forward. That idea of what was useful for you was somebody who'd been through it and could now coach them through it, rather than just as a clinician, somebody who studied it, and you're essentially able to coach people through that from that very personal perspective with all that you've learned. And so finally, you mentioned that you're grateful for your eating disorder. Tell us about that. Why are you grateful for it? Because people might look back and go, that was 8 months of my life, and it was much longer than that. That was 8 months of recovery, but a hell of a lot, many years of dealing with trauma and all the rest of it in your own way. Why are you grateful for your eating disorder?
Yeah. Yeah, it took robbed me of half my life, I guess. And yeah, 8 months in inpatient treatment, and then recovery ever since, really. But my God, like Petra, I am such a better human being. I'm more loving. I feel content in myself, I guess. Carolyn, the founder of the place, she always calls your body your suitcase for your soul. and I feel kind of okay in my suitcase. Yeah, I'm grateful that I now have the connections that I have, the opportunities that I have to feel content in myself, to feel that I can live in this world without needing to use unhealthy coping mechanisms to get my needs met. I'm a much kinder, wholesome person, probably a lot nicer to be around, and feel self-confident and know what I want from the world and from my life, and I don't believe I'd have met lovely people like you and all the other people without having it. So yeah, for sure, I'm grateful now.
And I'm so grateful to have met you, because I agree with it myself, that it's the adversity that we face, the challenges that we face, that turn us into who we really need to be and allow us to focus on the purpose that can help us impact so many lives. I'm so proud of you, Laura, and I'm so proud to know you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.